Thank you, Ryan, for coming here today to talk about how the New Zealand government's Better Public Services programme is lifting productivity in the public services. I was just wondering what your views were on why public sector productivity is important.
Well, productivity really matters to New Zealanders. We know from our Kiwis Count survey that value for money is one of the 5 key drivers of satisfaction for New Zealand citizens when it comes to their public services. So the reality is that productivity, the ability to deliver better services for less, matters to New Zealanders. It matters at any time. We also know that we live in a fiscal climate where the reality is that there is significant fiscal constraint and we've got to keep delivering better services in that environment. But I also think that productivity is about more than just inputs and outputs. It's not just about efficiency, it's about results, because ultimately when you're looking at what's going to drive the overall cost structure of the delivery of public services in New Zealand, it's the sort of results we're delivering, and if we can improve outcomes for vulnerable kids, if we can reduce crime rates, if we can reduce rheumatic fever, for instance, we know that the flow-on effects of that into the system down the track are really significant.
So I was wondering what your view is on why public sector productivity is important.
Well, I mean, New Zealand has a great public services, but everybody has a productivity challenge at the moment. The reality is the constraints of the global financial crisis, the continuing pace of change of the environment we live in a way that means that our services have to respond to that change, means that when you've got changing services and less money, you're always going to have a productivity challenge. And the reality is New Zealand, like a range of other countries, is having to respond to that. We've got a basic level of fiscal constraint in place, which means that every agency in the New Zealand Public Services is having to return an efficiency dividend to government of around 3 to 6% in terms of their baseline budget. And they know that that's going to be the reality over years to come, which means that at base we've got a real productivity challenge. But as I've said before, the productivity challenge is also built into the degree to which when you've got a changing demand for services, you actually have to be doing things better to get better results. And that's a constant productivity challenge for the public services anywhere.
So do you think we have a problem with public sector productivity in New Zealand?
I do, and that's something that the Better Public Services Advisory Group report recognised. On one hand, as I said, that's about base efficiency, and we're engaging in a range of initiatives that are about trying to improve the overall efficiency of our system. But the really more pressing thing is that we know that while New Zealand does great on a range of outcomes, there's another range of outcomes that New Zealand doesn't perform that well on, that if you look at us on, say, OECD comparators, we're spending more and getting worse outcomes than other countries, which suggests to us that better outcomes are possible because others are achieving them, but that we're not doing everything we can to get there. And because those are, particularly in those areas of social services or justice that have significant long tails and flow-ons into the system, we know that if we can make a small difference to those results over time, that will make a big difference, to our overall economic situation.
Now, Ryan, you've been involved in the Better Public Services programme right from the start, and I was wondering, how important was lifting productivity in driving the Better Public Services agenda? The
Better Public Services agenda proper probably started a few years ago now, but it had a series of precursor projects which were really focused on the better services for less mantra, about how could we look at the impact of the global financial crisis and the fiscal constraint and continue to deliver the increases in services that we'd been after. I think it was really the journey of having the advisory group come in, and that was a group of senior public servants matched with some experts from the private sector, bringing different perspectives to the table, and that group met over a space of 6 to 9 months to form a report to the Prime Minister. And the essence of that report that really changed the game a bit for us was getting beyond that efficiency focus, which wasn't lost in the report, and that value for money aspect is core, but said the real game changer here is really reorganising how we think about how we do things in our system to focus on results. So bringing us together to work in different ways. New Zealand has a very devolved public service, on some measures the most devolved public service in the world, and that's given us a great deal of strength in terms of the ability of individual agencies and chief executives to get on and do what they think is necessary. But it means that there's a real opportunity there in the system to bring people to work together in different ways on those really wicked and difficult problems that are hard to address.
So I was wondering if we could talk about how productivity is being addressed in the Better Public Services programme.
Well, I've already talked about the core constraints that are in place. So the government has put in place this expectation of an efficiency dividend from departments, so a constraint and declining baseline in terms of agency budgets. We've also got a cap in place, which means that the government has said, here is the number of core public services, excluding a couple of critical frontline roles, and the public service is not allowed to go above that cap. So on one level, we've got some absolute constraints in place that are supposed to drive towards productivity. But we're also pressing towards value for money. And so one example of this, which is something that a range of countries in the world are taking an approach like this at the moment, is we're very focused on functional leadership. So particularly in the areas of ICT, property and procurement, we have given someone the mandate of leading that functional activity for the system, and on one hand, driving towards efficiency. So we've got a group based in our Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment who are in charge of procurement. They're in charge of whole of government contracts and how we can get more efficient purchasing of a whole range of products that government needs to buy. We also have a property function, which is a new thing for us, bringing together the ability of different agencies to negotiate property leases collectively. So recently that group negotiated for 5 large departments in Wellington, cut 30% off the floor plate and 20% off the projected go-forward costs by having those 5 agencies negotiate together. Now that's a distinctive thing to the New Zealand system, because our system has been very, very devolved in terms of the individual ability of agencies to determine their own needs and negotiate for those needs. So there's a lot of gains in our system from that sort of base level efficiency. But just staying on functional leadership, I think the thing that's really exciting about functional leadership isn't actually so much the efficiency. That's important and it's a bit of a no-brainer, and it's something we need to be fixing up in our system. But it's the degree to which in areas of property and procurement and ICT in particular, what the functional leader can really do is build confidence across the system in the basic standards, the basic assurance, the fact that we're capturing the low-hanging fruit, if you like, in terms of efficiency, in order to give people the space to do things really differently. So in order to give people the space to think about how they use space differently in the property space, or how they think about contracting differently in the procurement space, or taking the ICT space with our Government Chief Information Officer. It's about how we give people, the people of New Zealand, the confidence that the public service can get on and do quite transformational things in the ICT space whilst maintaining their confidence in the core of our systems.
Okay, so there's a bit of a focus on innovation in the programme, would you say?
Yeah, there is. I mean, the reality is that if you're really going to drive results, the determining thing about the set of results that we've identified, and we have the luxury in New Zealand now that the Prime Minister has identified 10 better public services results. So they're results about vulnerable children, about justice, about education, welfare reform, and about integrated service delivery. And the luxury in terms of having those results is that it gives you a real focus on areas where we're not doing as well as we should be. But by definition, if we're not doing as well as we should be, we've got to significantly change the way we're doing things. And that's got to be about innovation. If you just keep doing things in the same way, we're going to keep getting the same results. And so I think what the results have really given us is a mandate to innovate, is the Prime Minister standing up and saying, for these particular results, I need you to work in different ways and do things differently. And often getting a real licence to innovate in the public services can be quite hard. We can be a bit risk averse, we can be a bit worried about what ministers will really have an appetite for, and the results are really a bit of a trigger of our ability to do that differently.
Okay, and would you say that the results are also about getting a more long-term view, having a more long-term focus on the things that are important?
They are. I mean, if I think about BPS in terms of the core things that it brings home to me, one is about results, one is about stewardship and that more long-term focus, and the other is about system leadership, so how we bring the system together about that. And they all overlap with each other. So with the results, on one hand, the most pressing thing there is that we get what our Minister of Finance is now calling collective impact, which he remarkably picked up from a non-governmental group here, and he loved the phrase so much that he started applying it across what we're trying to do. And he's saying, you've got to come together and work in different ways to get these results. But again, by their nature, the results have all got targets for 2017. So they've been set as 5-year results. They've got interim targets as well, but the base target that we're trying to achieve is a 5-year improvement. And of course, if you're talking about vulnerable kids, it's not just 5 years, it's 10 years and 15 years and 20 years. Which means that on one hand, you've got this current drive for efficiency, forcing people to focus on the here and now and getting their efficiency dividends, but you've got an environment where we're saying, actually, if we want to achieve these results in the medium term, then we've got to think about our system through a stewardship lens. We've got to say, not only what gets you your budget bottom line for today, but how do we ensure that we are investing in the right capability and capacity and focusing on the right ways of shifting our system to deliver results in the medium term. Now that's an old challenge, but we're trying to approach it in new ways. So if I picked up one example for you of how we're doing that, we've got quite a focus at the moment on 4-year plans. It's a fairly simple idea, but it's a new one to our system and the way we're working on it. So 4-year plans are an approach to integrating a medium-term budget plan and a medium-term workforce plan for an agency. So every agency in our system at the moment has to be able to articulate over the next 4 years what are the changes they see in their agency and in their sector in relation to the system. They have to be able to articulate what the fiscal implications of that. They have to have a medium-term budget view in terms of a 4-year vision of where that will take them. But they also have to have a perspective on their workforce demands, on the capability and capacity and systems that will be required to deliver on that 4-year plan. Now, as I said, on some levels that's stating the absolute obvious, but it's a new thing in our system to demand that everybody brings that together, to pull them, to have them viewed from a whole of system level, and then, as we're doing with everything at the moment, trying to get everything out there in the public domain. So our results are publicly facing, our progress on our results are publicly facing. Once we've got 4-year plans in place, they're publicly facing, and that's all part of bringing everybody into a space where they recognise that we have to be able to convince New Zealanders that we're doing the right thing now, but we're also planning to be able to do the right thing in the future.
So how successful do you think the Better Public Services approach has been? I mean, the programme's only been running for just about a year, is that right? It
was always envisioned as a 5-year program, so obviously I've got that obvious excuse that we're only a year in. But I think one of the themes I haven't picked up yet is the one about system leadership. And in some ways you'd expect to see changes in leadership coming in early in the program if they're going to draw dividends further down the track. So we got a number of policy changes through early last year. One of them was getting a head of state services put in place. Now that's something new to our system. So the State Services Commissioner, who has had the job of appointing chief executives in our system for 100 years. It's the centenary, in fact, this year of bringing in a politically neutral and merit-based system in New Zealand. But this year is the first time that we've had a head of state services. That is, that the Commissioner has been given that specific responsibility for the overall well-being of the system and for being directly accountable to the Prime Minister for whether that system is fit for purpose now and in the future. And that's an achievement in and of itself, but it obviously only matters if it's making a difference. And one of the things that the head of state services is making a difference on is it means that on issues of change in our system, there's no real question about where the buck stops, because the buck ultimately stops with the head of state services. But that means that when he is dealing with chief executives, whether they're functional leaders or result leaders or sector leaders or just leading their agency, that they know who's going to be holding them to account and that their actions are going to be seen in a broader system context. And that's quite a big psychological change for our system. I think that if you follow down system leadership, functional leaders are already making quite a difference. I've already talked about the efficiency gains we're getting from property and procurement and ICT. But ICT in particular at the moment, there's a lot of pressure in New Zealand right now around issues of privacy and security. If people who are watching this in Australia have followed the New Zealand news at all, we've had a range of leaks, we've had a range of privacy breaches in the public domain, and that's putting a lot of pressure back on the system. And the Prime Minister has been able to go to our Government Chief Information Officer and say, you are the leading point of accountability for ensuring that we're making the changes to the system to give the people of New Zealand the confidence that we're getting on top of this issue. And that's been quite a change in terms of how we're driving things. And I think we're going to progressively see quite a lot of change coming out of the results work.
What kind of progress has been made in actually agencies working together to deliver these results?
Yeah. The results are still in mixed space. That's not trying to cast aspersions against anyone who's working really hard on it. But the reality is across 10 results, some of those were relatively well positioned to go really fast off the back of the Prime Minister's announcement. And some of them had much more challenging greenfields operations in terms of thinking how are we actually going to approach this problem. So I think on some of our results, particularly some of our results in the justice sector, we've seen real traction early. And one of the advantages there is that the justice sector, so that's our corrections team, our justice team including courts and our police team, we're already starting to work on ways that they could work together to manage the justice pipeline. So that reality that if police change their policy, it affects justice in the court system, it affects corrections, and conversely if corrections can reduce the recidivism rates, it affects the whole cycle inside the justice system. So because those guys were already coming together and working, what they've been able to do is fairly rapidly shift into a space where they have a sector board. The 3 chief executives of those agencies come together and determine strategy and overall resource distribution across that sector together. And that's been able to make quite a rapid change in terms of the way they're focusing on their work on reducing crime rates and reducing recidivism. And we've seen really great early traction there. My comparison would be to something like results 9 and 10. So they're the results around integrated services. Result 9 is about integrating business services. And result 10 is about integrating digital services for citizens. And while we had a range of pieces of work going on that, it's fair to say we did not have a whole of system approach to that, with real traction. And that has meant that the challenge of getting together the way people work together, the way people put governance in place, the way they make decisions about that in a way that cuts across the decision rights of individual agencies, but without unduly constraining their ability to get on and transform their business models, is actually quite tricky. And I think result 9, the business services integration is the real example of that at the moment, because prior to that result, we had a range of different players leading on different aspects of that program. So in reality, it's taken us most of a year to get to a point where we have a clear governance structure and a clear way of going forward on that.
And what about political mandate? Did you have support from the government for the Better Public Services programme?
We have, and that's obviously critical. On one hand, the Prime Minister himself asked for the Better Public Services Advisory Group report and received that report. And having his imprimatur in behind the need for change has been incredibly important. And the main reference point on that for me has been, as we have encountered more risk, whether it's economic risk or the sort of privacy and security risk that I was talking about in the ICT space, the ability of the Prime Minister to stay the course and on one hand say, you have to mitigate these risks, you have to control them, that's part of your job, but not at the cost of not capturing the opportunity, has been the real mandate that we've needed out of political support in this process. So between the Prime Minister, our Minister of Finance has been incredibly supportive, and of course our Minister of State Services. And those 3 working together have been able to get in behind the idea that we're not just trying to trim some dollars off our system. We're trying to really rethink the way we get the speed of change in our system now and on a sustainable basis to really accelerate. Because that's the thing that the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of State Services have really been demanding from people. And Moff and Moss will come to our events with our senior leaders, and they will regularly rock up and they will give very strong messages to our chief executives and to our second and third tier leaders about the fact that they have to lead this change and the expectations that are on them, and that's critical to making progress.
That's great. Thank you very much, Ryan.
Thanks, Louise.